On the morning of October 8th, 1943, at 09:15 hours, Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski crouched behind the waist gun of a B-17 Flying Fortress at 23,000 feet over Bremen, watching three Focke-Wulf 190 fighters circle his formation like wolves preparing to strike, fighters that had been tearing apart American bomber formations for 6 months with a tactical approach that no gunner had been able to counter. At 27 years old, he was a waist gunner with the 91st Bombardment Group, with 0 confirmed kills, manning a 50 caliber Browning machine gun that every experienced gunner in the 8th Air Force said was positioned wrong. The gun mount allowed gunners to swing their weapons in wide arcs, covering the bomber's vulnerable midsection, but the barrel angle was locked at 90 degrees perpendicular to the fuselage, exactly as Army Air Force's regulations specified. When Kowalski first suggested angling his gun barrel 15 degrees forward during a maintenance inspection at Bassingbourn 3 weeks earlier, his crew chief had laughed out loud. Master Sergeant Frank Del Vecchio told him to stop reading comic books and stick to the manual that had been written by engineers who actually understood ballistics and aerodynamics. The other waist gunners joked that Kowalski's modification would throw off his aim and waste ammunition on empty sky. Even the aircraft commander. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. Captain James Rutherford dismissed it as the kind of idea that sounds clever until you actually try it in combat. The barrel angle itself seemed insignificant, a 15-degree forward cant that barely changed the gun's silhouette. But as Kowalski watched the lead Focke-Wulf begin its attack run, diving from 7 o'clock high with its wings already sparkling from cannon fire, he was about to discover that sometimes the difference between life and death is measured in degrees rather than distance. The Luftwaffe pilots had no idea what that angled barrel could do to their carefully rehearsed attack pattern. The B-17 Flying Fortress arrived over England in the summer of 1942, carrying a reputation that its crews would spend the next 3 years trying to defend. The aircraft was supposed to be a flying fortress in more than name, bristling with enough defensive armament to fight its way through enemy airspace without fighter escort. 13 50 caliber machine guns positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire that would shred any German fighter foolish enough to approach within effective range. Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski watched his first B-17 land at Bassingbourn in August 1942 with the mixture of awe and skepticism that characterized most gunners seeing the aircraft for the first time. The bomber sat on the concrete hardstand with its 4 engines silent and its gun positions visible through the plexiglass like promises of invulnerability. But Kowalski had heard the rumors from crews already flying combat missions, rumors about German fighters that attacked from angles the guns couldn't cover, and tactics that turned the fortress's defensive fire into an exercise in futility. The specifications looked impressive on paper. The waist guns, 2 50 caliber Browning machine guns mounted on opposite sides of the fuselage just aft of the wings, were positioned to defend against beam attacks, the side approaches that German fighters had favored during earlier phases of the air war. Each gun was mounted on a pivot that allowed the gunner to swing it through a wide arc, theoretically covering everything from directly abeam to positions well forward and aft of the bomber's midsection. The Army Air Force's manual specified that gun barrels should be mounted perpendicular to the fuselage at a 90-degree angle, providing what engineers calculated as optimal coverage of the defensive envelope. Maximum effective range was listed as 1,000 yards, though experienced gunners knew that hitting a maneuvering fighter at anything beyond 400 yards required equal parts skill and luck. Rate of fire was 800 rounds per minute, which sounded devastating until you calculated that a 3-second burst consumed 40 rounds, and most gunners carried only 500 rounds total. Master Sergeant Frank Del Vecchio made his opinion of new gunners clear during Kowalski's first day at Bassingbourn. He walked around the waist gun position with his hands on his hips, stopping to examine the mounting bracket with obvious skepticism. "Son, this gun is positioned exactly where it needs to be. Engineers spent thousands of hours calculating fields of fire, ammunition expenditure rates, and defensive coverage patterns. Your job is to point it at Germans and press the trigger. Not redesign the entire defensive system. Del Vecchio kicked the gun mount with his boot. The Krauts come in from the beam. You swing your gun to track them. They break away. You follow them as far as the mount allows. Simple, effective, and proven by every bomber mission since we started flying over Europe. What you don't do is start moving things around because you think you're smarter than the people who designed this aircraft. Kowalski had been asking himself different questions for weeks. He had studied the mission reports that filtered back from the combat squadrons, reading between the official language to understand what was actually happening at 20,000 feet over Germany. American bombers were being shot down at rates that threatened to make daylight strategic bombing unsustainable, and the losses weren't random. German fighter pilots had identified specific attack angles and tactics that exploited gaps in the B-17s' defensive coverage, and they were using those tactics with devastating effectiveness. The Focke-Wulf 190 had changed everything. Introduced to combat in late 1941, the Fw-190 was faster, more heavily armed, and more rugged than anything the Luftwaffe had previously fielded against American bombers. Its top speed of 410 miles per hour at altitude meant it could overtake B-17 formations, make attack runs, and break away before gunners could bring sustained fire to bear. The aircraft carried 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns, firepower sufficient to destroy a bomber with a single, well-placed burst. Lieutenant Hans Müller summed up German tactical doctrine during a captured pilot interrogation in September 1943. We attack from ahead and above, or from directly astern. The American gunners cannot track us effectively when we approach from 12 o'clock high because their waist guns cannot swing far enough forward and their nose guns are inadequate. We dive through the formation, fire at point-blank range, and break away below the bombers, where the ball turret gunner loses his tracking angle. The tactical problem was geometric. A German fighter approaching from 12 o'clock high, the position directly ahead and above the bomber formation, entered an engagement zone that waist gunners couldn't effectively cover. The gun mounts allowed traverse from beam to beam and elevation from horizontal to near vertical. But the perpendicular barrel angle meant that forward firing positions required the gunner to swing his weapon to its maximum forward limit and still be shooting at an oblique angle rather than directly into the fighter's approach path. By the time a diving Fw-190 entered the optimal firing envelope for a waist gunner with a standard mount, the German pilot had already released his burst and was breaking away, presenting a fleeting target that disappeared before the gunner could achieve sustained fire. Training missions revealed the defensive gaps in brutal mathematical detail. During simulated attacks at the Bovington Gunnery Range, instructors flying captured German aircraft demonstrated the 12 o'clock high approach that had become standard Luftwaffe doctrine. They would position themselves 4,000 feet above and 2 miles ahead of the practice formation, then dive at a 45-degree angle directly toward the lead bomber. Trainee gunners would swing their waist guns forward, trying to track the approaching fighter, and discover that their barrels were pointing at empty sky, while the threat aircraft bore down on positions their weapons couldn't effectively cover. Technical Sergeant Raymond Clapper logged the results in his training report. Attempted engagement of simulated fighter attacking from 12 o'clock high could not achieve effective firing position until target had already passed through his attack envelope and was breaking away. Observed approximately 2.3 seconds of potential firing time against target moving at closing speed of approximately 500 miles per hour. Hit probability estimated at less than 5%. The psychological impact on gunner morale was immediate and corrosive. These were men who had volunteered for one of the most dangerous positions in military aviation, accepting odds that were frankly terrifying in exchange for the promise that their weapons could defend their aircraft and their crew. The revelation that German fighters could attack from positions where defensive fire was largely ineffective transformed courage into helplessness, and gunners found themselves watching friends die in aircraft that were supposed to be flying fortresses. Kowalski watched his squadron's confidence erode with each mission briefing. These were experienced aerial gunners who had completed gunnery school and survival training, men who understood the mechanics of their weapons and had practiced their craft until loading and firing became muscle memory. But the Fw-190 made them feel like targets in a shooting gallery, unable to effectively engage threats that killed with mechanical precision and tactical sophistication. The aircraft's defensive philosophy created additional problems during combat conditions. The B-17s' overlapping fields of fire were designed to create a protective envelope where multiple gunners could engage a single threat, theoretically increasing hit probability and forcing attackers to break off their runs early. But the doctrine assumed that German fighters would attack from beam positions where waist, dorsal, and ball turret gunners could all bring their weapons to bear simultaneously. When Luftwaffe pilots shifted to head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high, the defensive coordination collapsed. The nose gunner would fire first with his single 50-caliber machine gun, achieving minimal results against armored fighters approaching at closing speeds that made accurate gunnery nearly impossible. The top turret gunner would engage next, but his angle of fire meant he was shooting almost straight up at a target diving toward him, a geometric nightmare that reduced hit probability to single digits. By the time the waist gunners could swing their weapons into firing position, the German fighter was already breaking away, either diving below the formation or pulling up and rolling away to either side. The ball turret gunner, positioned in a rotating sphere beneath the bomber's belly, could track diving fighters, but only after they had completed their attack runs and were already beyond effective range. The entire defensive system was designed for a threat that had evolved beyond its parameters. By September 1943, squadron readiness reports painted a stark picture. Of the 18 aircraft in the 91st Bombardment Group, an average of 4 returned from each mission with casualties or significant battle damage, most of it concentrated in the forward sections where the 12 o'clock high attacks were most effective. Gunner proficiency ratings remained high during training, but combat effectiveness scores were dropping as men struggled with defensive scenarios that their weapons couldn't adequately address. The strategic implications were becoming impossible to ignore as loss rates threatened to outpace replacement aircraft and crew training capacity. The 8th Air Force was fighting a war in 3 dimensions, and the B-17's defensive armament was proving inadequate in at least one of them. The innovation came not from engineering studies or tactical directives, but from a frustrated gunner who spent his nights reading maintenance manuals and his days watching German fighters attack from angles his weapon couldn't cover. On the evening of September 15th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski sat in the armament shed at Bassingbourn with a technical drawing of the waist gun mount spread across a workbench, calculating firing angles with a slide rule and noting the results in a composition notebook that he kept hidden from the other gunners. The mathematics were straightforward once you understood the geometry of aerial combat. A German fighter diving from 12 o'clock high at a 45-degree angle was traveling in a straight line relative to his own aircraft. But from the waist gunner's position, that straight line appeared as a complex, 3-dimensional curve that required the gunner to lead his target while simultaneously adjusting for the fighter's closure rate, his own bomber's forward motion, and the ballistic drop of 50-caliber rounds traveling nearly a mile through thin air at altitude. And Kowalski's insight was that the perpendicular barrel angle forced gunners to swing their weapons through a wider arc to track forward threats, increasing the time lag between target identification and effective firing position. If the barrel was already angled 15 degrees forward when the gunner was in his rest position, the initial swing time would be reduced by approximately 0.8 seconds, a seemingly insignificant interval that represented nearly half the total engagement time available against a diving Fw-190. The modification itself was mechanically simple but doctrinally radical. Kowalski proposed adding a 15-degree angle bracket to the gun mount, canting the barrel forward so that when the weapon was in its neutral position, it was already pointing ahead of the bomber's beam rather than perpendicular to the fuselage. The change would reduce the maximum rearward traverse by 15 degrees, creating a small gap in coverage directly astern, but would significantly improve the weapon's effectiveness against forward attacks that were killing crews at unsustainable rates. Master Sergeant Delvecchio found Kowalski working on the prototype bracket during a maintenance inspection 3 days later. The crew chief stood in the doorway of the armament shed with his arms crossed, watching as Kowalski welded steel plate into a configuration that violated every specification in the manual. "Son, what exactly do you think you're doing with that gun mount?" Kowalski looked up from his welding torch and pulled off his goggles. "Solving a problem that's getting people killed, Sergeant. The standard mount can't track forward attacks effectively. By the time I swing my gun into position, the German fighter has already fired and is breaking away. This bracket angles my barrel forward so I can engage threats earlier in their attack run." Delvecchio walked over and examined the modified bracket with the expression of a man watching someone deliberately break an expensive piece of equipment. "And what happens when a fighter attacks from your 6 o'clock and you can't swing your gun far enough aft to engage him because you've reduced your rearward traverse?" "Then the tail gunner takes the shot. Same as he does now," Kowalski replied. "But we're not losing aircraft to 6 o'clock attacks, Sergeant. We're losing them to 12 o'clock high approaches that our current defensive setup can't counter. I've run the numbers. The 15-degree forward cant gives me almost a full second of additional firing time against diving attacks, and that second could mean the difference between a fighter breaking off his run and pressing his attack to lethal range." The crew chief studied the bracket for a long moment, his expression shifting from disapproval to grudging interest. "You understand that if you install this thing and it doesn't work, you'll be court-martialed for unauthorized modification of military equipment, and if it does work but something else goes wrong, like reduced rearward coverage, getting someone killed, you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you made a change that had consequences." Kowalski met his eyes directly. "With respect, Sergeant, I already spend every mission watching fighters attack from positions I can't defend against. At least, this way I'm trying to do something about it, instead of just following regulations that aren't working." Delvecchio was quiet for several seconds, then reached out and picked up the modified bracket, testing its weight and examining the welds. "You get one test flight," he said finally. "If Captain Rutherford approves it, and the modification doesn't affect aircraft performance or create safety issues, I'll authorize installation on your gun position only. But you're going to document everything, every engagement, every round fired, every result, because if this actually works, we're going to need data to convince the engineering officers that we should make this modification across the entire squadron." The test flight took place on September 23rd, 1943, during a training mission over the English Channel. Kowalski's B-17 flew in formation with 2 other bombers, while Royal Air Force Spitfires made simulated attack runs from various angles and altitudes. The modified gun mount performed exactly as Kowalski had calculated, allowing him to bring his weapon to bear on 12 o'clock high attacks nearly a full second earlier than the standard perpendicular mount would have permitted. The difference seemed insignificant until you translated it into tactical terms. 1 second of firing time at 800 rounds per minute meant approximately 13 additional rounds on target and against a fighter approaching at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Those 13 rounds could be delivered while the target was still outside the range where his own weapons were most effective. The geometric advantage was clear. The angled barrel allowed the gunner to engage threats during the approach phase of their attack rather than waiting until they had already entered their firing envelope. Captain Rutherford reviewed the test results with the skepticism of a commander who had seen too many clever ideas fail under combat conditions. Standing in the operations tent, with Kowalski's documentation spread across a map table, he traced the firing angles with his finger and compared them to official attack pattern diagrams captured from German fighter units. "The math checks out," he said finally. "But math and combat are different things. The question is whether this actually results in destroyed fighters or just makes you feel better about shooting at them. The answer to that question would come during the mission to Bremen on October 8th. 1943, when Kowalski's modified gun mount faced its first real test against Luftwaffe fighters that had no interest in training exercises or theoretical calculations. The mission briefing for Bremen began at 0400 hours on October 8th. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 1943, in the operations building at Bassingbourn, where Major Thomas Saunders stood before a wall map marked with red lines showing the ingress route, target area, and planned withdrawal path. Intelligence indicated moderate to heavy fighter opposition, particularly during the initial penetration of German airspace and the withdrawal after bombs away. The target was the Focke-Wulf manufacturing facility at Bremen, one of several factories producing the Fw-190 fighters that were destroying American bombers at unsustainable rates. Captain Rutherford addressed his crew during their private briefing 30 minutes later. "This is a maximum effort mission. 21 aircraft from our group, over 300 bombers total across all groups participating. Intelligence expects heavy fighter opposition, particularly from the Fw-190 units based at Wunstorf and Vector." Kowalski sat in the back of the room, checking and rechecking his ammunition belts while trying to ignore the familiar pre-mission anxiety that never diminished, no matter how many times he climbed into that aircraft. The modified gun mount had been installed on his weapon for 2 weeks, but this would be its first test against actual enemy fighters, and he was acutely aware that if the modification failed, if it caused problems he hadn't anticipated, the consequences would extend beyond his own survival. The takeoff sequence began at 0630 with B-17s from the 91st Bombardment Group lifting off from Bassingbourn at 30-second intervals, climbing through the English morning darkness toward their assembly altitude. Kowalski watched through his waist window as other bombers appeared around them, navigation lights winking in the pre-dawn sky as the formation slowly took shape. By 0715, they were crossing the English coast at 15,000 feet, still climbing toward their combat altitude of 23,000 feet. The formation crossed into German airspace at 0840, and the first fighter attacks began almost immediately. Kowalski heard the top turret gunner's 50 caliber machine gun open fire, the distinctive rhythm of controlled bursts signaling that targets were in range. Through his window, he could see Fw-190s circling the formation at a distance, their pilots assessing the defensive setup and looking for vulnerable positions to exploit. The Luftwaffe tactical approach was methodical and practiced. Fighters would position themselves ahead and above the bomber stream, then execute coordinated diving attacks from 12 o'clock high, targeting the lead elements of each formation where they could achieve the greatest disruption. The first German fighter to attack Kowalski's bomber appeared as a dark speck at 12 o'clock high, 4,000 feet above their altitude and perhaps 2 miles ahead. Kowalski watched through his forward-facing window as the Fw-190 rolled into its dive, the characteristic elliptical wings becoming visible as the range closed. At standard doctrine, he would have waited until the fighter entered his normal engagement zone before beginning his tracking sequence, losing precious seconds while the German pilot lined up his shot, but the modified mount changed the geometry. Kowalski swung his gun to the forward limit of its traverse and found that his barrel was already pointing close to the fighter's projected flight path. The 15-degree forward cant had eliminated most of the initial swing time, allowing him to begin tracking immediately. At 1,200 yards, he opened fire. The first burst was purely suppressive, intended to signal the German pilot that he was under fire and force him to consider defensive maneuvering rather than focusing exclusively on his own attack run. The tracers arced away from the bomber, appearing to move slowly at first, but accelerating as they closed the distance. Kowalski watched his rounds pass ahead of the target, adjusted his lead angle, and fired again. The second burst connected. At 900 yards, Kowalski saw his tracers intersect the Fw-190's flight path, several rounds sparking off the fighter's engine cowling and wings. The effect on the German pilot was immediate. the Fw-190's dive angle steepened abruptly as the pilot pushed his nose down, breaking off his attack run before reaching his optimal firing position. Instead of pressing to point-blank range, where his cannons would be devastatingly effective, the German fighter dove away, passing beneath the bomber formation and disappearing from Kowalski's field of view without firing a shot. The engagement had lasted approximately 4 seconds from initial contact to the fighter's breakaway, and Kowalski had achieved sustained fire for nearly half that duration, something that would have been impossible with the standard perpendicular mount. The other waist gunner, Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, had witnessed the entire sequence through his own window. He keyed his intercom with obvious excitement. "Did you see that? You broke off his attack before he could fire." That modification actually worked, but there was no time for reflection. The formation was under continuous attack from multiple directions as German fighters exploited any gap in the defensive coverage. Kowalski swung his gun to track another Fw-190 approaching from 10 o'clock high, the angled barrel allowing him to engage while the fighter was still well outside the range where his cannons would be effective. The psychological impact on the attacking pilots was becoming apparent. Fw-190s that would normally press their attacks to within 200 yards before breaking away were now disengaging at greater distances, unwilling to fly through sustained defensive fire that began earlier in their approach runs than doctrine suggested should be possible. The Germans had trained for combat against B-17s with specific defensive capabilities and known blind spots. The modified gun mount disrupted those tactical assumptions in ways that forced immediate adaptation. Oberleutnant Heinrich Schneider, leading a staffel of Fw-190s from Jagdgeschwader 26, had executed the 12 o'clock high attack pattern hundreds of times against American bombers. The procedure was mechanical. Position yourself above and ahead of the formation. Roll into a 45-degree dive. Track your target through your gun sight. Wait until the bomber filled your windscreen. Fire a 2-second burst from all weapons. Then dive away before the defensive fire became concentrated. He destroyed 11 B-17s using this exact approach, and he entered his attack run on Kowalski's bomber with the confidence of a pilot executing a practiced routine. At 1,500 yards, he rolled his aircraft into the dive, centering the bomber in his reflector sight and beginning his firing sequence calculations. At 1,200 yards, he saw tracers arcing toward his aircraft from the bomber's waist position several seconds earlier than he expected defensive fire to begin. The tracers were inaccurate at that range, passing ahead of his flight path, but they signaled that he was under sustained fire and that the gunner had achieved a firing position earlier in the attack sequence than should have been possible. Schneider maintained his dive, adjusting his aim point to compensate for the bomber's evasive maneuvering. At 900 yards, he saw more tracers, this time closer to his aircraft, and heard the distinctive crack of 50 caliber rounds passing near his canopy. The psychological calculation shifted instantly. To press his attack to effective firing range, he would have to fly through sustained defensive fire for at least 3 more seconds, accepting hits that might damage critical systems or injure him before he could release his own weapons. The tactical doctrine emphasized survivability. German pilots were too valuable and too difficult to replace to waste on suicide runs against heavily defended targets. Schneider broke off his attack at 800 yards, diving beneath the formation without firing. His mission a failure, but his aircraft undamaged. By 0930, the pattern had repeated itself 8 times. German fighters would set up their standard 12 o'clock high attacks, encounter earlier and more sustained defensive fire than their training had prepared them for, and break away before reaching effective firing range. The modified gun mount was achieving exactly what Kowalski had predicted, extending the engagement envelope forward by eliminating the time lag inherent in the perpendicular barrel angle, giving the defender a tactical advantage measured in fractions of seconds but expressed in survival. The bomber formation pressed deeper into German airspace, and the fighter attacks intensified. At 0945, 3 Fw-190s attacked simultaneously from 12 o'clock high, 11 o'clock high, and 1 o'clock high. attempting to saturate the defensive fire and ensure that at least one fighter could reach effective firing range. Kowalski engaged the center fighter, achieving hits at 1,000 yards that forced an early breakaway, while Chen tracked the 11 o'clock threat and the top turret gunner engaged the 1 o'clock fighter. The coordinated defensive fire disrupted all three attack runs, and none of the German fighters achieved effective firing positions. Captain Rutherford's voice came over the intercom with obvious satisfaction. "Good shooting, waist guns. You're breaking up their attack patterns before they can get organized. Keep it up." The mission reached the initial point at 1000 hours, and the bomber formation began its bombing run. German fighters continued to press their attacks, but with noticeably less aggression than earlier in the mission. The Luftwaffe pilots had learned that approaching from 12 o'clock high would subject them to sustained defensive fire that began earlier and lasted longer than their tactical doctrine anticipated, and they were adapting by increasing their breakaway ranges and reducing their time in the defensive envelope. The modification that Master Sergeant Del Vecchio had authorized as a one-time experiment was changing the tactical calculus of aerial combat over Germany. The transformation was measured not just in fighters destroyed, which remained difficult to confirm amid the chaos of formation combat, but in attack runs disrupted, German pilots forced to break away early, and bombers that returned to base without the battle damage that 12 o'clock high attacks typically inflicted. By the time Kowalski's bomber crossed back into friendly airspace at 11:30 hours, the mission recorder showed that he had engaged 17 separate fighter attacks, achieving hits on at least 6 German aircraft and forcing early breakaways on another 8. None of the fighters he engaged had reached effective firing range against his bomber. The intelligence assessment arrived 18 hours later, compiled from gun camera footage, pilot reports, and interrogations of German prisoners captured after bailing out of damaged aircraft. The analysis confirmed what Kowalski had observed during combat. The modified gun mount had extended the effective engagement range against forward attacks by approximately 200 yards and reduced the time required to achieve initial firing position by 0.9 seconds. Those advantages had translated into a measurably higher rate of attack disruptions and a corresponding reduction in successful German firing passes against bombers equipped with the modification. More significantly, Luftwaffe pilots were showing evidence of tactical adaptation specifically related to the modified defensive fire patterns. Intercepted German radio communications included references to American bombers with enhanced forward defensive capabilities, and prisoner interrogations revealed that fighter pilots were being briefed to expect earlier and more sustained defensive fire from certain B-17s in the formation. The modification had been in combat use for exactly one mission, and the enemy was already adjusting their tactics to account for it. Master Sergeant Del Vecchio found Kowalski in the armament shed that evening, cleaning his gun while documenting the mission results in his composition notebook. The crew chief stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. 17 engagements, 6 confirmed hits, 8 disrupted attack runs, no battle damage to your aircraft from forward attacks. Those are numbers that engineering officers pay attention to. Kowalski looked up from his weapon maintenance. "Does that mean you're authorizing the modification for other aircraft?" Del Vecchio walked over and examined the angled gun mount, running his hand along the welded bracket that had performed flawlessly through 4 hours of combat operations. "I'm authorizing it for the entire squadron. But you're going to help install them. Because if I'm going to modify 18 aircraft based on one sergeant's idea, I want that sergeant personally responsible for making sure every installation is done correctly." The strategic implications of the barrel angle modification extended far beyond the 91st Bombardment Group. Within 3 weeks of the Bremen mission, word of Kowalski's innovation had spread through the 8th Air Force's maintenance and armament networks, carried by crew chiefs who shared technical information during cross-group coordination meetings and by pilots who discussed defensive tactics during mission debriefings. The modification was simple enough that any competent armorer could fabricate the angle bracket using materials available at every bomber base in England, and the performance advantages were too significant to ignore. By November 1943, over 200 B-17s in the 8th Air Force had been modified with forward-canted waist gun barrels, most of them using Kowalski's 15-degree angle as the standard specification. The impact on mission effectiveness was measurable in casualty statistics and loss rates. Bomber groups using the modified mounts reported a 17% reduction in battle damage from forward fighter attacks during November compared to October, and a corresponding decrease in aircraft lost to fighter action during the critical moments when formations were most vulnerable to 12 o'clock high approaches. The Luftwaffe response to the modified defensive tactics came with characteristic German thoroughness. By December 1943, fighter units were receiving updated tactical directives that explicitly addressed the enhanced forward defensive capabilities of American bombers. The new doctrine emphasized coordinated attacks from multiple angles simultaneously, forcing defensive gunners to divide their attention and reducing the effectiveness of improved forward coverage. German pilots were instructed to break away at greater ranges when encountering sustained defensive fire and to use hit-and-run tactics rather than pressing attacks to point-blank range. Oberleutnant Schneider, who had broken off his attack against Kowalski's bomber during the Bremen mission, later wrote in his tactical report that American defensive fire had become more effective during the initial phases of attack runs. The report noted that waist gunners were achieving firing positions earlier than previous tactical estimates suggested, and recommended maintaining breakaway discipline even when target acquisition appeared favorable. The adaptation cycle between offensive tactics and defensive capabilities was accelerating, each side learning from combat experience and adjusting their approaches to counter enemy innovations. For Kowalski personally, the success of his modification brought recognition that transformed his role within the squadron. Promoted to technical sergeant and assigned to work with armament officers on additional defensive improvements, he found himself consulting on projects that ranged from ammunition feed mechanisms to gun sight modifications. His composition notebook, which had begun as a private record of his calculations and observations, became an official reference document used by engineering teams studying defensive effectiveness across the 8th Air Force. The human cost of aerial combat remained brutal despite technological improvements. The 15-degree barrel angle could extend engagement ranges and disrupt attack patterns, but it couldn't eliminate the fundamental arithmetic of strategic bombing, that sending hundreds of bombers into defended airspace would result in losses that no defensive modification could completely prevent. Kowalski flew 23 more combat missions after Bremen, and on each one, he watched German fighters probe the formations looking for weaknesses, watched bombers fall out of formation, trailing smoke and fire, watched parachutes blossom in the thin air as crews abandoned aircraft that could no longer stay airborne. The psychological burden of innovation was different from the burden of following established procedures. When you made a modification that changed tactical outcomes, you carried responsibility not just for your own survival, but for every crew that adopted your approach. Kowalski learned this during a mission to Schweinfurt in February 1944, when a bomber equipped with his modified gun mount took battle damage that might have been prevented if the waist gunner had maintained full rearward traverse coverage. The investigation determined that the reduced rearward coverage hadn't been the decisive factor, that the bomber would likely have been damaged regardless of the gun mount configuration. But Kowalski spent weeks analyzing the engagement sequence and questioning whether his modification had contributed to the loss. By the spring of 1944, as P-51 Mustang fighters began providing long-range escort for bomber missions, the tactical environment over Germany changed dramatically. The presence of American fighters capable of engaging Luftwaffe interceptors throughout the mission profile reduced the pressure on bomber defensive systems and allowed formations to proceed with fewer fighter attacks. The strategic significance of defensive improvements, like Kowalski's barrel angle modification, diminished as escort fighters took over the primary responsibility for protecting the bomber stream. But the principle that Kowalski had demonstrated remained relevant, that individual initiative and practical innovation could solve tactical problems that formal doctrine had failed to address. The lesson was incorporated into training programs and maintenance procedures throughout the Army Air Forces, encouraging gunners and ground crews to identify defensive gaps and propose modifications rather than simply accepting existing systems as optimal. The culture of innovation that emerged from combat experience would influence American military aviation for decades beyond the end of the war. On May 7, 1945, when Germany surrendered and the strategic bombing campaign ended, Technical Sergeant Michael Kowalski had completed 47 combat missions and had been credited with 3 confirmed fighter kills and 14 probable destructions or damages. Those numbers told only part of the story. The modified gun mount that he had developed in an armament shed at Bassingbourn had been adopted by over 800 B-17s and B-24 bombers across multiple bomb groups, and tactical analysis suggested that the modification had contributed to preventing or reducing battle damage on hundreds of combat missions. The human cost of innovation was impossible to calculate precisely, but intelligence estimates suggested that improved defensive effectiveness had saved dozens of bombers and hundreds of lives during the final year of the European Air War. Kowalski returned to civilian life in August 1945, taking a job as a machinist in Detroit, where his skills with metalworking and mechanical systems found immediate application in the post-war industrial boom. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, and most of his co-workers never knew that the quiet man operating the lathe in the corner of the shop had modified the defensive armament of hundreds of bombers and changed tactical doctrine for the United States Army Air Forces. The composition notebook, where he had documented his calculations and observations, remained in a drawer at his home, a private record of the problem-solving process that had turned a frustrated gunner's idea into a tactical innovation. The technical legacy of the barrel angle modification extended into the post-war development of defensive armament systems. When the United States Air Force, which became independent from the Army in 1947, began designing the next generation of strategic bombers, the lessons learned from Kowalski's innovation informed the engineering specifications for gun mount systems. The B-36 Peacemaker and B-47 Stratojet incorporated defensive armament that could engage threats from forward positions more effectively than the perpendicular mounts of World War II-era bombers, and the tactical doctrine emphasized early engagement of attacking fighters rather than waiting for them to enter close range. By the 1960s, advances in surface-to-air missiles and jet fighter performance had made defensive guns on strategic bombers largely obsolete, but the principle that small geometric advantages could create measurable tactical benefits remained embedded in military aviation doctrine. The 15-degree angle that had seemed insignificant to Master Sergeant Del Vecchio in September 1943 had demonstrated that innovation didn't require revolutionary technology or massive resource investments. Sometimes it just required someone willing to question whether existing solutions were actually optimal for the problems they were supposed to solve. Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski died in 1978 at the age of 62, having lived a quiet life, far removed from the strategic bombing campaigns that had made him briefly famous among the bomber crews of the 8th Air Force. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press mentioned his military service in a single sentence, noting that he had been a waist gunner on B-17 bombers during World War II. There was no mention of the modified gun mount or the tactical innovation that had changed defensive doctrine for hundreds of aircraft, because by then the story had been largely forgotten, except by military historians studying the technical evolution of aerial combat. The lasting significance of Kowalski's modification was not the specific 15-degree angle or the mechanical details of the bracket that supported it, but the demonstration that tactical problems could be solved by people closest to their practical application, rather than waiting for solutions to emerge from formal engineering processes or command directives. The armament shed at Bassingbourn, where he had fabricated his prototype bracket, was demolished in 1946 when the airfield was decommissioned, but the principle he had established, that geometric advantages measured in fractions of seconds could determine the outcome of combat engagements, remained embedded in the institutional knowledge of military aviation. Sometimes the difference between survival and destruction was measured not in the sophistication of your weapons or the courage of your crews, but in the willingness of one sergeant to spend his evenings calculating firing angles and his days welding steel brackets that his superiors initially dismissed as a waste of time and equipment. The tactical revolution began not with new technology or revolutionary doctrine, but with a simple question. What if we just pointed the gun in a slightly different direction? Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.